The water was already on before she'd lit the second lamp. That was the thing about habit. It didn't ask permission. Her hands had done this 10,000 mornings, filled the pot, set it to heat, laid the instruments out on the clean cloth in their proper order. And her hands did it now without consulting the rest of her, without checking against the folded paper in her apron pocket that said she had until Sunday. Outside, the February mud had frozen again overnight, and the yard crackled faintly under the wind. Inside, the small clapboard house held its heat, the way it always had, imperfectly but stubbornly, warmth pooling near the stove and thinning at the walls where the boards had never quite fitted flush. She had caulked those gaps herself, 3 winters running. She knew where every draft lived. The instruments went in one at a time. The long-handled scissors, the curved needle, the small bone-handled forceps she'd carried since before Ashwater had a proper name, back when the settlement was 4 buildings and a prayer. She watched the water begin to shiver, then to roll, and she did not look at the trunk open in the corner of the room. The hound had not moved from the doorway. He was old, gray across the muzzle and deep in the chest, with one ear that had never stood straight after the incident with the mule 3 springs past. He lay with his chin on his forepaws and his eyes half open, watching the yard through the gap at the bottom of the door with the particular attention of a creature who understood that certain mornings required vigilance. She had named him for patience. She had not known, when she did it, how much of her own life would be a study in the same. She reached down and laid one hand briefly on his side as she passed. He exhaled. 6 days. That was what the decree gave her. 6 days from the moment Elder Marsh had come to her gate with his hat in his hands, and the paper folded in his coat, and the careful expression of a man doing something he had persuaded himself was righteous. She had read it on the porch in the cold, Job pressing against her leg, and she had not said the things she might have said. She had said, "I see." She had gone inside and put the kettle on. That had been Monday last week. This was Monday again. 1 week since the board had decided that Ashwater needed a name to put on what had happened in February, and hers was the most convenient name available. She understood the logic. She did not accept it, but she understood it the way you understand a winter storm, not as something personal, but as something vast and indifferent that would do what it intended regardless of your preparations. The water boiled. She lowered the scissors in. In the trunk, between a folded quilt and her mother's Bible, there were still 2 empty inches of space she hadn't decided what to fill with yet. The scissors could wait. She turned from the stove and looked at what the week had made of her front room. It was not disorder exactly. She was not a disordered woman, but there was a quality to the room that she recognized from other houses, other times, the quality of a life in the process of being sorted into what mattered and what didn't, and the sorting not yet finished. A crate near the window held her spare linens, a second held the iron pot and the skillet and the Dutch oven she had used precisely once in 11 years for something other than sterilizing. Between them, the gap where the rocking chair had stood before she'd decided it was too heavy to move and too good to leave. She began with the shelf above the door. Candles, a rusted tin of needles, a length of cord. Things that had accumulated the way things do in a house where a woman lives alone and useful objects migrate to wherever she last set them down. She put what was worth selling in the crate and what wasn't in the scrap pile by the door. It was in reaching for the back of the shelf, behind the jar of dried chamomile she'd forgotten was there, that her hand found the logbook. It was smaller than she remembered. Black cloth cover, warped slightly at the spine from a winter she didn't recall, the pages dense with her own handwriting going back to the first year she'd worked, without the doctor standing over her shoulder. She hadn't opened it in some time. She opened it now. The entries were dated. She had always dated them. March 14th, 75. Caldwell, Mrs. A., first child, male, presented well, 6 pounds by estimate. Mother recovering. The handwriting of the early years was more careful than the later, the letters a little larger, the way a person writes when they are still trying to prove something. She turned pages slowly, not reading, just letting the dates pass under her thumb. She counted without intending to. The count happened on its own, the way certain reckonings do, not because you go looking for them, but because they were always sitting there, patient, waiting for you to stop moving long enough to look. 41. 41 living children in Ashwater. 41 entries that ended with the same small notation she had developed over the years. Mother well, child well, no further intervention required. 41 families that had gone on into their ordinary lives without, she supposed, thinking much about the particular Tuesday or March night when everything might have gone differently. She did not count the one she had lost. That was not how she kept her books. She closed the logbook, held it a moment with both hands, the cloth cover slightly warm from her palms. Then she set it in the trunk, flat against her mother's Bible, fitting it into the 2 inches of space she hadn't known what to fill with. The scissors were still in the pot. She went back to the stove. The scissors came out of the pot clean and bright, and she laid them on the cloth to dry the way she always had, points toward the window so the light could find the edges. It was a habit, with no audience now. She did it anyway. She was standing at the basin when she heard the gate. Job heard it first. His ears came up before his head did, that slow assembling attention of an old dog who has learned not to waste energy on things that will not matter. But he rose. That meant it would matter. The woman who came up the path was Cora Pell, from the 3rd house past the grain depot, a woman Hannah had helped twice, though she would not have said so aloud in present company. She carried a basket covered with a flour sack cloth, and she walked the way a person walks when they are not entirely sure they should be walking there at all, purposeful from the gate, slower at the steps, stopped altogether at the door. She said she had some things that wanted washing, if Hannah was still taking in work this week. Hannah looked at the basket. Then she looked at Cora Pell's face, which was doing several things at once, and managing none of them well. She took the basket. They worked out the price in the yard, 2 bits for the lot, which was fair, and Cora set down the coins one at a time on the porch rail, as though placing them too quickly might constitute an argument. Hannah left them there for a moment before she picked them up. She did not know exactly why. Some transactions want a breath of air before they close. There was a pause then, the kind that fills itself if you let it. I thought what they said about the Greer woman, Cora began, and then stopped. Hannah waited. I thought it was... Another stop. Cora's hands moved once, briefly, over the flour sack cloth that was no longer covering anything. I signed the paper, she said finally. I want you to know I've thought on it since. It was not an apology. It was not quite brave enough to be an apology, but it was a woman standing in a yard she didn't have to stand in, saying a thing she didn't have to say, and Hannah had learned over 11 years to take the measure of what people could actually give, rather than the measure of what she wished they'd brought. She said she would have the linens back by Thursday. Cora nodded and went the way she came, a little faster than she'd arrived, and Job watched her go from the step with the impartial attention of a dog who passes no verdicts. Hannah carried the basket inside, set it by the stove, stood a moment with her hands on the cloth, feeling the warm weight of other people's ordinary laundry, the smell of it, wood smoke and use, and understood that something had shifted, though she could not have said yet which direction it was falling. She needed salt and wrapping paper, and that was all she let herself need. The general store sat at the center of Ashwater the way a knot sits at the center of a plank. Everything else grew out from it, or around it, or tried to avoid it. She walked the half-mile with her coat buttoned and her basket on her arm. Job staying home for once, too stiff in his haunches for the cold mud of the road. She noticed that without him she walked differently, more exposed. She kept her chin level and her pace even, the way she had learned to move through a room where people had already made up their minds about her. The 2 men were near the hardware side, between the nail kegs and the coils of rope. She did not know their names. She knew their type, cattlemen's hands, the kind who wintered in town and grew loud with too much time. She had her back to them at the counter when she heard it. Whole thing was plain as day. One said, "You get a woman playing at doctoring, that's what you get." The other made a sound of agreement, something between a grunt and a laugh. "That doctor," the first one continued. "I heard he rode hard as he could, ice roads and all. Hard to fault a man for weather." Hannah set 2 coins on the counter. The storekeeper wrapped her paper around the salt block without looking up. He'd heard too. She could tell by the precise, deliberate way he folded the corners. She said nothing. She took her package and she walked out. The cold hit her face like the flat of a hand, and she kept walking, down the 2 board steps and onto the road, her boots finding the packed ridges of old wheel ruts. She did not look back. She did not hurry. She let the distance open behind her, 1 step and then another, until the voices were just the murmur of a building she had already left. But then she began to read the road. It was something she did without deciding to, the same reflex that made her check a woman's breathing between contractions, the same attending that kept her hands moving even when the mind was elsewhere. The mud told what it knew. Wagon tracks too fresh for yesterday, running deep on the right side. A load weighted heavily, heading north toward the Dunmore land. Hoofprints along the verge. A single horse moving fast 2, maybe 3 hours ago, the toe kick sharp and urgent. A scrap of oilcloth snagged on the fence post at the edge of the road, not there when she'd passed Tuesday. Small things, ordinary things, the kind a person saw without seeing, unless they had spent 11 years learning that ordinary things were exactly what came just before the extraordinary. She stood a moment at the fork where the road bent toward home, her package of salt under her arm, the gray sky pressing low over the plain. Something was moving, somewhere out ahead of her. She could not yet see what. She walked home with the salt under her arm, and the unease she could not name walking beside her. The house was the same as she'd left it, trunk half-packed against the far wall, the good linens folded, the instruments wrapped in their flannel roll beside the basin. Job lifted his head from the doorway as she came in, decided she was not a threat, and lowered it again. The coal oil lamp was still burning on the table where she'd left it. She had forgotten to put it out. That was not like her. She set the salt on the shelf and stood a moment looking at the trunk. She had told herself she was packing in order. The sensible things first, the winter coat, the good wool stockings, the tin cup and spoon, then the papers, then, last, the things that were harder to lift. She had been putting off the bottom of the trunk for 3 days now, which meant she had been putting it off since Monday, which meant some part of her already knew what was down there. She knelt on the floor and unpacked what she'd packed. The manual was wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, her mother's habit, not hers, though she'd kept it up without thinking. It was small and dense, its spine cracked and recracked until it stayed open to certain pages by itself, like a book that had formed opinions. Her mother's handwriting ran in the margins in brown ink, corrections and confirmations, and the occasional sharp word for the author. Wrong, C. Tarnier. This depends. She had been a precise woman, Hannah's mother, precise and unsparing and, Hannah had only understood this later, deeply afraid of the things she could not control, which was why she had spent her life learning to control more. She opened it to the marked passage. She didn't need to search. The spine opened there on its own. In cases of incomplete rotation, the practitioner must not wait on nature. Time spent waiting invites exhaustion of the mother and increases hemorrhage risk. The hand, placed with patience at the fundus and the lower pole simultaneously, may encourage rotation, but only if applied before the presenting part descends too far into the pelvis. After that point, rotation is no longer possible by this means. Her mother had underlined the last sentence twice and written in the margin, "This is the line. Once past it, you have only what God gives you." Hannah had read those words so many times, they were part of her. More habit than reading now, the way a psalm sits in the chest. She had been past that line in February, or nearly past it. She had applied the technique at the exact moment it could still be applied, and she had done it correctly, and the child had turned. But by then the damage from the long labor was done, and the doctor's horses were still 9 miles out in the ice. Job shifted in the doorway. Outside, the plain was dark and the wind had picked up. She kept reading. Thursday came in cold and flat, the sky the color of old tin, and Hannah was out at the line before 8 with a basket of other people's shirts. The work was plain, and she was grateful for it. There was a rhythm to hanging laundry that asked nothing of the mind. The reach, the pin, the pull of the next piece from the basket, and her hands had been restless all week, moving from task to task the way water moves in a dish when the table is unsteady. The instruments were boiled, the trunk was half packed, the kitchen was clean enough to eat from. She had run out of things to do that were not the one thing she kept not doing, which was walking out the gate for the last time. So she hung shirts. 8 of them, belonging to the Pruitt household, which had 6 sons and a father who worked the freight depot and no woman in it since spring. She pinned each one by the shoulders, straight, the way her mother had taught her, so they would not dry with creases at the seams. Job was on the step in the thin morning sun when the horse came. She heard the hoofbeats before she turned. A single horse, walking pace, not the canter of someone with news. She did not look up immediately. She reached for another shirt, shook it out, raised her arms to the line. When she did look, she recognized him at once. The big bay gelding with the blaze, the oiled saddle, the particular way Loyal Dunmore sat a horse, weight back, reins loose, like a man who had nothing to prove and knew it. He was riding the road that ran along the front of her property, the same road every soul in Ashwater used, and there was nothing unusual in his being on it. Except that he had slowed to a walk, except that he was looking at the house, not at her specifically, at the house. The gate with no sign on it, the clapboard siding, the dark window of the room she used as her parlor and examination room both. He looked the way a man looks at a thing he is trying to remember accurately, not in passing, but with a particular attention, like he was taking a measurement. Job raised his gray head from the step. His ears did not go up in the sharp way of alarm, but in the quiet way of recognition, of something being registered and filed. Dunmore did not stop. His horse kept walking, slow as a Sunday, and then the road curved past the stand of bare cottonwoods and he was gone. Hannah lowered her arms. She stood with a damp shirt in her hands and the wind moving lightly through the line above her, setting the dry shirts to swinging. She did not know what she had just seen, but her hands, without instruction from any conscious thought, began to move more carefully, smoothing the seams before she pinned them, making sure each piece hung straight and true. Thursday came and went without visitors. Friday she rose before light. She had not planned to boil the instruments again. The kit was packed, had been packed since Tuesday, folded into the oilcloth sleeve she'd carried for 11 years, the forceps nested against the speculum, the cord scissors in their separate wrap of flannel. There was no professional reason to unpack it. She was leaving Sunday. The instruments would travel with her to wherever she went, and wherever she went, she would reboil them before using them, because that was the rule she had made herself when she was 23, and learning what she could not afford to lose. She boiled them anyway. The small pot came to a full roll just as the sky turned from black to the particular iron gray that comes before dawn in February. Or March, she reminded herself. It was March now. The light would last a little longer each day. She watched the water bubble and counted, as she always counted, and then she lifted the instruments with the wooden tongs and laid them on the clean linen to cool, and then she wrapped them again in their flannel and nested them again in the oilcloth sleeve and set the bag by the door. Job lay across the threshold, his chin on his forepaws, watching her with the quiet, undemanding attention he had maintained all week. She worked through the morning. There was laundry to finish and fold, and she had promised herself she would leave the house clean, not because she owed the next occupant anything, but because she did not know how to leave a thing in disorder. She beat the mattress tick. She swept the examination room a final time and stood in the doorway, looking at the bare table, the empty shelf, the nail where the lamp had hung before she'd taken it down to pack. The afternoon was still. A finch landed on the fence and left. At dusk, she heard the horse before she saw it. Not the slow Sunday walk of a man passing with a private thought. Hard hoofbeats, irregular, the sound of a horse pushed past its comfortable pace. She was at the window before she knew she'd crossed the room. He came through the gate without stopping, the animal blowing hard, the rider barely keeping his seat. He pulled up short of the porch and did not dismount cleanly. He half fell, caught himself on the stirrup, and was standing in her yard looking up at her with an expression she had only seen on a man's face a few times in her life, stripped entirely of pride. 4 words. Ada, early. Doctor's gone. Hannah Vosberg did not hesitate. She did not ask how far, or how many weeks, or whether Ada Dunmore had signed her name to a petition in February, because none of that was the question the moment was asking. She turned from the window, crossed the room in 3 steps, and picked up the bag. Job rose from the doorway, stepped aside, let her pass. The horse was lathered when she tied it to the post. She did not wait for him to lead her inside. She went up the porch steps ahead of him, pushed through the door, and followed the sound. A woman in pain does not sound like a woman in ordinary distress. Hannah had learned this early and never forgotten it, the particular quality of that sound, low and concentrated, like a note held too long. It was coming from the top of the stairs. She climbed without removing her coat. The room was hot. Someone had stoked the stove in the corner too high, the way people do when they feel helpless and need something to tend. A lamp burned on the table beside the bed. 2 women, a ranch hand's wife and an older woman Hannah did not recognize, stood back against the wall as she entered, their faces identically grateful and frightened. She registered them and moved past. Ada Dunmore lay on her side, her dark hair loose across the pillow, her face sheened with effort. She was 31 or 32, younger than Hannah had expected somehow, though she knew Ada's age the way you know things in a small town, without ever learning them directly. Their eyes met, and whatever had been between them in February, the petition, the signature, the choosing of a side, was not in the room. What was in the room was simpler and more urgent than that. Hannah set the bag on the chair, washed her hands in the basin, opened the bag and removed the lamp to position it closer. Then she laid one hand on Ada's abdomen, gently, with the flat of her palm, and closed her eyes. She had done this so many times that her hands knew things before her mind did. She pressed and measured, shifted her palm, pressed again. The child was not presenting head down or foot down. The child was sideways. Transverse, as she had been taught to call it by a woman 30 years dead who had learned it the same way, from another woman's hands, in another hard room, in another year of failing light. She opened her eyes. She told Ada plainly, not softly, not harshly, plainly, the way you tell someone what the ground looks like before they have to walk it. The baby is turned crosswise. I have to reach in and move the child. It will hurt considerably. You'll need to hold on to something and trust that I know where my hands are going. Ada looked at her. Her face was white. Her breathing was shallow and controlled, the kind of control that costs everything. She said nothing. She gave a single nod, small, deliberate, the nod of a woman who has run out of options and is choosing the one that remains. Hannah rolled her sleeves. She spoke one more sentence to the women against the wall. Keep that stove steady and bring water when I ask for it. Then she turned back to the bed. The 9 hours began. The first hour taught her what she was dealing with. The child had settled into the transverse lie with the stubbornness of something that did not yet know it was in danger, shoulder leading, spine arched, occupying the womb crossways like a beam wedged in a doorframe. Hannah worked slowly. Her hands moved in the darkness of the body, with the kind of deliberate patience that looks, from the outside, like calm, and is not. It is the opposite of calm. It is every thought narrowed to a single corridor. The housemaid held the lamp. Her arm shook. Hannah said, "Steadier." Without looking up, and the arm steadied, and that was the whole of their conversation for a long while. Outside the door, at the top of the stairs, she could hear him, the heavy, irregular shift of weight that meant a man sitting where he could not see and could not leave. She did not think about him. She filed him away the way you file away weather you cannot change. Ada's fever climbed in the second hour, peaked, and Hannah changed the linen beneath her while she was still lying in it. A thing that requires a particular economy of movement, a rolling and tucking that her hands knew without instruction. Fresh linen, cooler. She called for the water, and the housemaid brought it, and Ada drank, and the fever did not break, but it stopped climbing. That was the first discovery. The outcome was not fixed. In the third hour the child shifted, not because Hannah forced it, but because she coaxed it, the distinction being everything. A rotation requires the body's cooperation. You offer the correction, and you wait, and you feel for the agreement. She felt it, a slow, incremental yielding, like a key finding its tumbler in the dark, and she did not rush it. She breathed. She kept her hands exactly where they were. Ada made a sound she would never make in any other context in her life. Hannah said, "I have it. Stay with me." The fourth hour was the hardest. The child had rotated to oblique, but not to vertex, halfway right, and a halfway correction at the wrong moment is worse than none. Hannah held position, hands aching, and waited. The lamp guttered. The housemaid refilled the oil without being asked. That small competence, that unasked-for readiness, loosened something in Hannah's chest, briefly, before she put it away. Sometime in the fifth hour, the child turned. Hannah felt the head descend past her fingertips into the proper channel, and the whole long architecture of the labor rearranged itself around that one movement, the way a room rearranges itself when the window is finally opened. She did not say anything. She allowed herself one slow breath. Then she called for more water, repositioned Ada's hips, and the next stage of work began. Different work, harder in some ways, but work she knew, work that had a direction now. The next hours were the oldest kind of work, the kind that does not announce itself, only continues. She called for clean linen when she needed it. She told Ada when to rest and when to bear down, and Ada, past the point of any pride she had ever carried into a room, obeyed the voice that knew. The housemaid moved at the edges of the lamplight like a quiet planet, bringing what was needed before it was asked for a second time, and Hannah filed that away somewhere, the girl's competence, her silence, and kept moving. The window paled by degrees. First, the black became charcoal, then charcoal became the flat gray of a February morning that had decided to be civil about itself, and in that gray hour, between one breath and the next, the child arrived. Small, startlingly small. But the first sound he made was not a question. It was a declaration, thin and furious, and Hannah felt it move through her hands before she heard it with her ears. She cleared his airway with 2 practiced strokes of her smallest finger. He answered her with more fury. She allowed herself nothing at that moment. Not relief, not prayer, not the sting behind her eyes she could feel gathering, because the cord still needed tying, and Ada still needed attending, and 40 years of knowing had taught her that the work does not pause for the worker's feelings. She tied the cord with the same hands that had done it 41 times before in this county. Steady. The knot was the same knot. The child was the 42nd. She wrapped him in the warmed linen the housemaid had set on the chair back. The girl had thought of that too, had set it near the lamp an hour ago, and she placed him in his mother's arms. Ada looked down at him. Then Ada looked up. The door had opened without Hannah noticing. The cattle baron stood in the frame, still dressed from the night before, his hat gone, his face carrying something it had not been built to carry. He tried once to speak, and did not manage it. He put one hand flat against the doorframe instead, as if the house needed steadying, and stood there. Ada did not look at him yet. She was still looking at Hannah, and the expression on her face, not gratitude exactly, not yet, because gratitude requires some distance, and there was none here, was the full weight of the thing she had signed her name to. It was written in her plainly. Ada Dunmore was not a woman who made small errors, and she knew this had not been a small error, and she was holding the proof of it in both arms. Hannah held her gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to her work, because Ada still needed care, and the light was just beginning to be enough to see by. The doctor arrived on horseback at 10:30, his coat still carrying the dust of 22 miles, and his face the particular worn expression of a man who had not slept and did not expect sympathy for it. The housemaid let him in without a word. He came up the stairs and stood in the doorway of the room where, some hours earlier, everything had been in the balance, and found instead a woman resting against banked pillows with an infant on her chest and color in her cheeks that had no business being there given what the night had held. He set down his bag. He looked at the mother. He looked at the child, the small, improbable fact of him, breathing with the unhurried confidence of someone who intended to stay. Then he looked at the woman standing at the washstand, drying her hands on a clean cloth, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that men are quiet when they are revising something they had already decided. She handed him the instrument log without being asked. She had kept it through the night in the margins of her own record book, times, temperatures noted by hand against the window glass, the presentation as she had found it, and the steps she had taken in sequence, written in the small plain hand of someone who had learned long ago that her word alone would not be sufficient. He read it the way a man reads a document he did not expect to find in order. He examined the mother first, then the child. His hands were thorough, and his face gave nothing away while he worked. But when he straightened and turned back to the room, the housemaid in the corner, the cattle baron standing just inside the door he had not left since daybreak, he spoke without particular ceremony. He said that the presentation had been correctly identified and correctly managed. He said that the recorded observations were consistent with what he found now. He said, and here his voice did not lower or soften, because he was stating a fact, and facts do not require softening, that the death in February had followed from a delay in arrival, and that no action taken by the midwife at that birth had caused or hastened it. The delay had been his. He had been 20 miles out. He had arrived when the outcome was already fixed. He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking at the log, and then at the wall just past it, in the manner of a man who is paying something he has owed for a long time and finds the paying less difficult than the carrying had been. The housemaid put her hand over her mouth. The cattle baron did not move. She set the cloth down on the washstand and turned back to her patient, because the baby had stirred, and the mother needed to know how to settle him, and that was the work in front of her now. She left Ada Dunmore's house before first light, while the household still breathed in the slow rhythm of exhausted sleep. She had written the instructions in full on 2 pages of folded paper and left them on the washstand beside the clean linens, what to watch for in the first 3 days, what was ordinary and what was not, how to bring the milk in, when to call again. She had done this at every birth she'd ever attended. She did it now without thinking, because it was the work, and the work had never required the town's permission. The road back was empty and pale with frost. Job fell into step beside her without being called, his breath making small clouds in the dark air, his nails clicking against the frozen ground. She carried her bag in one hand. The instruments inside it were clean. They had always been clean. She went home and she slept. Sunday morning came up clear and cold. The sky the particular blue that follows a hard week, wide and without apology. She was in the yard when they arrived, the three men of the church board moving up the road in their good coats, their hats set with the gravity of men performing an errand they have decided is necessary and just. She did not go inside. She set her bag down at her feet and waited, and Job sat down beside the bag and looked at them with his yellow eyes, and he did not growl. They saw the cattle baron first. He was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, still wearing the clothes he'd slept in, because he had not gone home. He had sent his foreman back to the house at dawn and remained himself, for reasons he did not explain and was not asked to explain. He nodded at the board when they came through the gate and said nothing else. He did not have to. The neighbor's husband was already at the gatepost with a hammer and 2 nails. He had cut the sign himself from a cedar plank, the letters drawn in pencil and then burned in clean and black. H. Vosberg, Midwife. 11 years she had worked this town without a shingle. He set the sign against the post and drove the first nail and then the second, while the board stood in the yard and watched, and the sound of it carried in the cold morning air, the way a fact carries when it has finally been said aloud. The board did not speak. There was nothing left to say that the week had not already answered. They stood a moment in the yard, their errand dissolved around them, and then they went the way they had come. She picked up her bag. Job pressed his gray muzzle against her knee once, briefly, then settled back on the step. The sign held straight on the gate. The sky above Ashwater was very blue, and she went inside to put the kettle on.